Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Tapey, Director of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies at St. Leo University, where I'm also an Associate Professor of Theology. I am joined by my colleague, Rabbi David Mayan, the Cohn Visiting Chair in Jewish Thought, and also Assistant Director of the Center. We would like to welcome you today to Contemporary Jewish and Catholic Perspectives on Just War, Session 2, where we will look at contemporary Catholic perspectives on just war. As you may know, the moral discourse surrounding the war between Israel and Hamas frequently employs or assumes the language of the just war tradition, including terms like combatants, noncombatants, and just cause. These and other just war terms emerged over hundreds of years as a part of a complex tradition, and really traditions, of reflection on when war can be morally justified. However, current usage of this language by some tends to lack the awareness of the debated meanings of these terms and how they sometimes function together. The aim of our series today is to deepen mutual understanding of both Jewish and the Catholic community, as well as all people of goodwill, on their perspectives on just war. Today's speaker, I'm very happy to say, and we're honored to have Dr. Tobias Winright, Professor of Moral Theology at St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth, Ireland. Dr. Winright will present part 2 of our series today. And I also want to say a few things by word of introduction to his background. He's a former law enforcement officer in both corrections and policing, initially with the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Pinellas County, for those of you who are tuning in from afar, is actually quite close to Tampa here in St. Pete and north of that region. Much of his teaching and scholarship focuses on Christian ethics, violence, and peace, and he has authored or co-authored or edited 7 books, including After the Smoke Clears, The Just War Tradition and Post-War Justice. Another book entitled Can War Be Just in the 21st Century? Ethicists Engage the Tradition. Another book entitled Serve and Protect, Selected Essays on Just Policing. And finally, the T&T Clark Handbook of Christian Ethics. Dr. Winright is a past editor of the Journal of Society of Christian Ethics and has served as vice president of the College Theology Society. Previously, he taught at St. Louis University, where he held the Maydair Endowed Chair in Healthcare Ethics, Walsh University, and also he's taught at Simpson College. To our online viewers, we are very glad you're here with us today, and we'd like to remind you to please use the question and answer button to submit any questions or comments that you might have. As Dr. Winright is speaking, don't hesitate to jot them down in this Q&A button, using the Q&A button. We'll have some time to review some of these at the end of the program, moderated by myself and Rabbi Mayan. Dr. Winright, we're so glad that you're with us today. We will give you the floor now, and thanks again for making time to present this information for us.
Thank you, Dr. Tapey, and thank you, Rabbi Mayan, for hosting and moderating this session. It is good to be with you all today. It's 4 hours difference right now instead of 5, so it's late afternoon and it's early evening here, and it's very good to do this presentation with you about this very unfortunately timely topic. I have many slides I want to go through. It's going to be a whirlwind. We could spend a whole entire semester just on this one topic with lectures 2 or 3 hours a week. So here we go. Peace be with you. I hope that many of you felt kind of the nudge or the urge to respond, and also with your spirit. In our Catholic tradition, our starting point is the peace that we experience and that we share in the Mass. This is something that's been highlighted in documents from the Catechism to the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church to the United States Catholic Bishops' Pastoral Letter, The Challenge of Peace from 1983, that the peace that we experience in the Mass is our starting point as well as our ending point. This is very important principle and theme for us in the Catholic moral tradition. Even the sign of peace during the Mass, a gesture that we do, that should be forming and shaping us to be a people of peace. And there are some statements here. These slides will be saved on the recording, so you can come back and read them at your leisure at some point. But this is very important, that the gestures we do, the sign of peace during Mass, should at some point over time gesture us, make us a people who are a people of peace, to be peacemakers. We follow the Lord Jesus Christ, who is known as the Prince of Peace. Now, that might be very hard to imagine, therefore, what I've put there on the bottom there, who would Jesus shoot? That's hard to imagine anything like that. At least it is for me, and I hope it is for you as well. Jesus taught, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." As Gaudium et Spes from Vatican II 60 years ago said, peace, however, is not merely the absence of war. It is rather based on justice and love and must be built up ceaselessly. So peace is a positive peace. It's very similar to the Hebrew word shalom, which is a harmonious peace, a positive peace, a peace that is a just peace. And Gaudium et Spes went on and said, for this reason, all Christians, all of us, are urgently summoned to do and love what the truth requires, and to join with all true peacemakers in pleading for peace and bringing it about. So, for this presentation, I'm going to examine the state of the question about what are the contemporary Catholic perspectives on just war. And here's kind of an outline of what this presentation will cover. I'm going to argue that legitimate defense, which Gaudium et Spes recognizes, is the new name for just war. And I will suggest that it should encompass not only armed, but also unarmed or non-violent defense against aggression. Accordingly, I propose a new name, and this is a first time I've proposed this in public, a new name for the Catholic position on just war: integral defense, sort of analogous to what Pope Francis has called for, an integral ecology. So I'm going to introduce this topic, go through a history and content of just war, and lead up to the present situation. Why do I care? As Dr. Tape mentioned, I used to work for the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department, first in corrections, and then subsequently I did do patrol. And then later on with Des Moines Police Department, I taught ethics for Des Moines Police Department in Iowa, and I also patrolled. So during all these years while I wore a uniform and a badge, I wrestled with that question: what would Jesus do? And could I envision Jesus and Jesus's followers actually using armed force, perhaps even deadly force? So I've been wrestling with this. I first began in 1984 with the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department. That photo there on the left is me and that's my mother in the middle. She was a deputy sheriff as well, and also a homicide detective. So ever since then, I really wrestled with many questions about the use of force and about violence and peace. Also, while I was an undergraduate, at first at St. Petersburg Junior College, now called St. Petersburg College, and then later at University of South Florida in St. Petersburg, I was in Army ROTC, and I did training even at Fort Benning. I considered that as a career, but I did not sign the form and follow through with it, because during that time, I wrestled with these questions about war and peace and the ethics of war and peace. Now, some of you may know that currently the idea or the concept of just war is being questioned, especially within Catholic circles. Cardinal Parolin this past year, a couple of times, said, we know that today there is a great deal of discussion on the issue of just war, that many doubt that we can speak of a just war, and the discussion will go on. We know that there's a lot of discussion today on the concept of just war as a war of defense. However, with the weapons that are available today, this concept has become very difficult. And I believe that there is not a definitive position, but that this concept is under review. So as a part of this process of reviewing the concept of just war, I am proposing integral defense. Back in 2016, there was a gathering of about 80 activists and scholars, Catholics, at the Vatican, hosted by Pax Christi International, as well as the Pontifical Consortium of Justice and Peace. And they issued an appeal saying that there is no just war. And they called on the church to no longer use or teach just war theory. They said the church should shift to and centralize just peace and nonviolent practices and strategies. They argued that this is consistent with gospel nonviolence, that Jesus taught and practiced nonviolence, the power of love in action. In the wake of that appeal, 1 year later, Pope Francis issued a message, World Day of Peace message, nonviolence, a style of politics for peace. So again, centralizing, prioritizing nonviolence. In that message, Francis said that in the most local and ordinary situations and in international order, may nonviolence become the hallmark of our decisions, our relationships, and our actions, indeed of political life in all its forms. To counter violence with violence can lead to the death, physical and spiritual, of many people, if not all. And he highlighted Jesus as marking out the path of nonviolence, so that to be true followers of Jesus today also includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence. So for Francis, the power of love, nonviolence, is more powerful than violence. This was emphasized in the World Day of Peace message, echoing sort of what that appeal the year before called for. Yet, often missed was this line from the World Day of Peace message. Peace building through active nonviolence is the natural and necessary complement to the church's continuing efforts to limit the use of force by the application of moral norms. It's a complement to what traditionally was called just war principles and theory, not a substitute for. That's an interesting line that I'll come back to later on. In Fratelli Tutti in 2020, Pope Francis wrote a little bit more about the topic, calling war a failure of politics and of humanity, a shameful capitulation, stinging defeat before the forces of evil. He added, we can no longer think of war as a solution because its risk will probably be greater than its supposed benefits. This weighing of risk and benefits is actually part of just war theory. I'll come back to that. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. So he says it's very difficult to do so. He does not say that it is impossible. He refers to the Catechism of the Catholic Church as speaking of the possibility of the legitimate defense by means of military force, which involves demonstrating that certain rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy have been met. I will again come back to this. Given these statements the last few years, many theologians have been asking, does this seeming papal endorsement of nonviolence transform Roman Catholic Church into a peace church, like the Quakers, like the Mennonites? Has Francis definitively renounced the just war approach? My friend Thomas Massaro, who's at Fordham University, says that the answers to these questions, while far from simple, are in the negative, at least for the time being. And he wrote this 3 years ago almost. Similarly, David Carroll Cochran at Loras University, Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa, wrote that developments are ongoing in this area of teaching that is still relatively fluid, and therefore one necessarily marked by a number of ambiguities and unanswered questions, especially around if and when armed force is ever morally permitted. And this is from his most recent book, The Catholic Case Against War, a brief guide. So let me back up a bit. The Christian tradition and the ethics of war and peace. Throughout the tradition, there have been two primary approaches to the ethics of war and peace amongst Christians, including Catholics: pacifism or nonviolence, and just war. Most scholars write that for the first few centuries, the norm of most Christians was actually pacifism or nonviolence. One example is from the Didache from the first century that talked about the way of life, love God, love your neighbor, pray for your enemies, and it prohibited all forms of murder, including murder of a child, abortion, infanticide, but all forms of murder were prohibited by this very early Christian document. Tertullian wrote that the Lord, by disarming Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane, unbelt every soldier. So these are some examples in early Christianity, and I list many there, even up to recent times, stopping with Martin Luther King Jr. Christians who have emphasized nonviolence, pacifism as the approach to dealing with injustice, oppression, aggression. Another early document, the Canons of Hippolytus, said of the magistrate, they did not have police yet, but the magistrate and the soldier, let them not kill anyone, even if they received the order to do so. Anyone who has received the power to kill, or else a soldier, let them not kill in any case, even if they received the order to kill. This view that was predominant, there may be exceptions, but this was predominant in early Christianity for the first 3 or 4 centuries, is very different from what many Christians today think and view with regard to this question about war and peace and violence. When did things start changing? Well, after Constantine became emperor and Christianity is recognized, no longer is persecuted, we start having Christians who are in office, political office, as well as in the military. And St. Ambrose of Milan was really one of the first, drawing on the Roman Cicero, but even Plato before that. So just war tradition has some roots in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. It also has analogs in other societies and cultures, East and West. But for Ambrose, he focused on love for neighbor. We're supposed to love our enemy and love our neighbor. And if our enemy that we're called to love is about to kill our neighbor that we're called to love, the love for the neighbor overrides the love for the enemy. Ambrose ruled out personal self-defense, though. You could only do this if you were a soldier or if you were responsible politically for the lives of others. So as far as individual personal self-defense, as well as for clergy, Ambrose said that you could not use deadly force. Only those responsible for others could use deadly force out of love for the innocent who are attacked. Ambrose was the teacher of St. Augustine, who drew on Ambrose as well as developed this a little bit. Like Ambrose, Augustine, who's often called the father of just war theory, Augustine said that killing others in order to defend your own life, I do not approve of this, unless one happened to be a soldier or a public functionary acting not for himself, but in defense of others. Augustine had 3 criteria: legitimate authority. And in his day, that would be the emperor, the ruler, appointed by God, and legitimate authority. No revolution. We could not just declare a war on our own or something like that. Only legitimate authorities, rulers, could call for a war. There had to be just cause. So in defense against attack, if somebody is taking something from you, then you could use force to right that injustice. And then right intention. And there's that quote, what is a right intention? Peace should be the object of your desire. War should be waged only as a necessity and waged only that through God may deliver men from that necessity and preserve them in peace. Therefore, even in waging war, cherish the spirit of a peacemaker, that by defeating those whom you attack, you may lead them back to the advantages of peace. So here, The right intention is a just peace, one that is even a restorative justice, aiming to restore even the enemy back to the advantages of peace. Centuries later, St. Thomas Aquinas, he writes a little bit about just war, and he employs the same three criteria that Augustine did: legitimate authority, just cause, right intention. Then he also added, he allowed for self-defense, unlike Augustine and Ambrose, that self-defense can be permissible. And he used the theory of double effect, that your intention is not the death of the enemy. If you could stop the enemy without their being killed, you would prefer to do that and you would pursue that. But they have forced your hand. This is out of necessity. So your intent is not their death, although you foresee, and this is the second one, this is the foreseen likelihood. So your intent is to protect the innocent, to save your people from aggression, and to restore the enemy back to the peace, even though you foresee that enemy combatants are going to be killed. And then he added proportionality, that, and this is one of the things that was mentioned earlier, the evils that, the consequences, the negative consequences that result should not outweigh the good that we are trying to achieve. Subsequent theologians, ethicists developed this, leading it ultimately to become, a few hundred years ago, international law. So some of those thinkers at the bottom of this slide are sometimes called the fathers of international law, leading to the law of armed conflict. That would be the secular way of referring to the Catholic tradition of just war. So just war categories and criteria. I'll walk through these. Most of these come from the U.S. Bishop's statement, The Challenge of Peace. First of all, you have a category called jus ad bellum, the justice in going to war. These are supposed to be met prior to embarking upon war. So there has to be right intent, the goal of a just peace. That needs to be the right intent, not conquest, not expansion, not colonization, not hatred, not revenge, restoring a just peace. There has to be just cause. And in the 20th century, that really got narrowed to defense of one's country or defense of others who are unable to defend themselves, allies or other people who maybe even are victims of genocide by their own government. So just cause has been more defensive in nature. Last resort. Have we exhausted all feasible nonviolent methods to address the problem? Have we tried diplomacy? Have we tried sanctions? Have we tried other methods to try to resolve the situation before resorting to armed force? Legitimate authority is still there, although now we have democracies and presidents and prime ministers and not just emperors and kings, but legitimate authority is important. And the key word there is legitimate. Over time, it was recognized even by the time of Aquinas that sometimes authority is no longer legitimate, especially if it's calling for something that is unjust or if the authority is tyrannical. So that's another important criterion. Proportionality, this is the big picture. Is going to war actually going to make things worse? Or is it going to address the problem and minimize the negative consequences? That's important overall. Probability of success. Again, these are the questions that just war tradition raises. It doesn't give any easy answers. It's a lot of probability. It's a lot of thinking and debating and discussing and trying to reassess constantly the situation. But probability of success, I mean, does it look like we can actually achieve this just and lasting peace? Are we going to be able to win? Are we really going to be able to defeat the enemy? These are important questions. United States Catholic bishops added comparative justice as a reminder that we should avoid a crusade mentality where we are self-righteous, we are the good guys and they are the bad guys. it's a recognition that there might be some shared blame and that there might be some fault on multiple sides, but we need to make sure that one side has more justice on its side than the other, the side that is appealing to just war in defense of itself. So those are usually the jus ad bellum criteria. There are also jus in bello criteria. These are principles that guide conduct during the war. So first of all is discrimination or distinction, distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, military personnel versus civilians. Now, there's kind of a spectrum there because there's some non-combatants who are actually very much involved in supporting the war. And there might be some who are wearing a uniform who are medical personnel who are not, fair game. So this is a principle trying to distinguish between who is actually a threat, who is most to blame, and who is not. And this is coming up in our current conflict, as we'll get to. And then proportionality on a micro level. Doesn't mean you use equal force. You use enough sufficient force to overcome the opponent. So it shouldn't be excessive force. Otherwise, that would be brutality, disproportionate. It should be just enough force in order to defeat the enemy. Those are the two jus in bello criteria. In recent decades, there have been scholars, including myself, who have been saying that right intention should actually lead to a third phase, jus post bellum, justice after war. And there's a lot of different criteria or practices that different scholars offer. But what needs to be done by all the nations involved to reconstruct, to rehabilitate, to hold those responsible for the causing the war in the first place accountable, to restore not only infrastructure and hospitals and education, but also the environment, the ecology, to clear landmines and cluster munitions so that people are not harmed, injured, and killed after the war is done. And then ultimately, reconciliation. Think Marshall Plan. For a long time, it was very hard for me to imagine the United States ever going to war against Japan or Germany because we and our allies did so much to rebuild those two former enemies of ours, so that jus post bellum actually should minimize the likelihood of another war flaring up again. Now, throughout all this, as the United States Catholic bishops highlight, for Catholics, the possibility of taking even one human life is a prospect we should consider in fear and trembling. In other words, the just war tradition, contrary to what a lot of people assume, is not meant to try to justify war and make war more likely to happen. It is actually an effort to limit war, to try to reduce the likelihood that it's going to happen. And it's only in fear and trembling that we even recognize that sometimes going to war is the morally right thing to do. Now, let me return for a moment to nonviolence and pacifism, though. Gaudium et Spes 60 years ago is the first time official recognition of nonviolence and pacifism. Instead of just limiting it to clergy and to religious, lay people were finally recognized again after 1600 years as is fine to renounce the use of armed force to defend yourself and to defend others. So there was lessons learned at this time, 1965, from Martin Luther King Jr. and from Gandhi that nonviolence can be effective. It actually can be an effective way to defend the peace and to kind of address injustice. And notice there's a qualifier there, though. Provided this can be done without injury to the rights and duties of others or of the community itself. So there's kind of a criterion right there about probability of success and proportionality that nonviolent defense is fine as long as it doesn't lead to greater evils or it does not lead to even more harm against what you're trying to defend itself. United States Catholic bishops, in their statement in 1983, similarly say that more needs to be done with regard to nonviolence. It best reflects the call of Jesus, but also we should study it more. We can learn and study more about how nations can defend themselves from attack, from unjust aggression without using violence. And there are many, many examples that we can turn to for these. They go on and say that this is not passive nonviolence, this is active nonviolent resistance. There are actually methods empirically verified that are effective in defending a just peace. Now, Gaudium et Spes, at the same time it recognized the importance of nonviolence as valid and legitimate and lauded it. They went on and said, we cannot deny that governments have a right to legitimate defense after every means of peaceful settlement have been exhausted. So last resort is there. And they say, military action should be for just defense of the people, not for the subjugation of other nations. And they rule out, the saying like all is fair in love and war. No, there are rules that still should apply even during war. They condemn total war, such as World War I, World War II. That's indiscriminate warfare. And then they actually condemned any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities, of extensive areas along with their population, is a crime against God and humanity. Very important. They're using just war reasoning to make these claims. The Catechism similarly talks about legitimate defense of persons. It's important. It's not only a right, but a grave duty for someone responsible for another's life. Legitimate authorities have the right to repel armed force against aggressors to the civil community that's entrusted to their charge. Like Gaudium et Spes, the Catechism praises those who renounce violence and use nonviolent methods, again with that same qualifier. But like Gaudium et Spes, and it quotes it there, as long as the danger of war persists, governments cannot be denied the right of lawful self-defense. 2309, the Catechism refers to strict conditions. At the bottom, these are the traditional elements enumerated in what is called the just war doctrine. It does not list all the criteria and break it down like I did a few slides ago, but you can see probability of success. You can see last resort. You can see proportionality. You can see that there has to be the right intent in here. Both the Catechism and Gaudium et Spes recognize that the church and human reason both assert the permanent validity of moral law during armed conflict. So total war, anything goes, is ruled out. There are moral rules that apply even during armed conflict. The mere fact that war has regrettably broken out does not mean that everything becomes licit between the warring parties. Gaudium et Spes did urge for us to undertake an evaluation of war with an entirely new attitude. And one of the things that is that it recognizes both nonviolence as well as legitimate defense that is armed, both. And Drew Christensen, the late Drew Christensen Jesuit, he wrote often about this, but ever since Gaudium et Spes, he argued that Catholic teaching has become more stringent in its application of just war thinking and more accepting of nonviolent alternatives even by the state. And I think we've seen that in the slides that I've gone through. The challenge of peace by the United States Catholic bishops therefore said the Christian has no choice but to defend peace. We all must defend peace, properly understood as a positive peace against aggression. This is an inalienable obligation. It is the how of defending peace which offers moral options, either nonviolence or armed defense called legitimate defense. Catholic teaching sees these two distinct moral responses as having a complementary relationship. Remember Pope Francis in his World Day of Peace message, he used that word complementary, that nonviolence is the natural complement to legitimate defense, understood as armed defense with the moral criteria. So the United States Catholic bishops have been arguing this for 40 years. Getting closer to Pope Francis again here. This is from 2023. While reaffirming the inalienable right to self-defense and the responsibility to protect those whose lives are threatened, we must acknowledge that war is always a defeat of humanity. No war is worth the loss of the life of even one human being. Sounds like the United States bishops there. A sacred being created in the image and likeness of the Creator. No war is worth the poisoning of our common home. So how do we reconcile these two things? There's an inalienable right to self-defense and responsibility to protect, but war is always a defeat or a loss. This is what's led to ambiguity and confusion amongst many people. Turning to what is happening in Israel and Gaza, and we could look at many other cases. A few days after the attack by Hamas on October 7th, Pope Francis acknowledged that it is the right of those who are attacked to defend themselves. So Pope Francis acknowledged the right of the state of Israel to defend its people from further attack by Hamas. However, Pope Francis expressed concern, even then, for the total siege facing the Palestinians in Gaza, where there have also been many innocent victims. And since then, obviously, it's only increased. Last I checked, one number I saw, 48,348 Palestinians have died. Some estimates say maybe 80% of those are not Hamas fighters, but civilians, many women and children. But others say that maybe 50% are fighters. Israel claims that 20,000 Hamas fighters have been killed, last I checked. Catholic moral theologians, and this is from a statement by Justice and Peace Commission of the Holy Land last summer, Catholic moral theologians around the world have also outlined how neither the attacks by Hamas on October 7th, nor Israel's devastating war in response satisfy the criteria for just war, according to Catholic doctrine. Terrorism is condemned by Gaudium et Spes. That's the intentional killing of civilians for political reason, and that has been condemned. At the same time, the Catholic position on just war is that all of the criteria must be satisfied for the war to be considered just, not only just cause to defend against aggression. All of the criteria have to be met. So we have difficult questions. Just war tradition, as I've tried to demonstrate, has developed and evolved over the centuries. The criteria have expanded, the categories have expanded, along with developments in technology, armaments. So, when just war was first theorized, there were swords and spears. And then there's the invention of gunpowder and planes and, all the things that we have today, all the way up to nuclear weapons and other forms of indiscriminate weapons of mass destruction. So how do we deal with these questions today? I mean, to even recognize that these are questions, though, kind of assumes that we're thinking by using these criteria, like Gaudium et Spes did with regard to total warfare, 20th century, the intentional targeting of civilian population centers. It was using actually these criteria to critique and condemn these things. The just war tradition is used just as much to say no to certain things as it is to say yes. So there are some difficult questions. One thing that some scholars have raised is the problem of punctualism or a lack of historical thickness. Too often in the past, just war theorists have focused on the present moment. What happened at this particular time and place? What happened on October 7th, 2023? What was the immediate response? Well, many people say, well, there's a whole background by decades here. What happened with the Holocaust, then the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, but then the displacement of Palestinians from their homes at that time. There's a lot going on here, and this is where the criterion of comparative justice may come into play, where no one is perfect in this situation. And just as the previous slide showed, what was done on October 7th by Hamas has been condemned by Catholic moral theologians. That was intentionally targeting civilians rather than only military bases. But then the response by Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces, perhaps that has also been indiscriminate, and so no side is perfect. Does that mean they're equal? Not necessarily. There's also the problem of urban warfare and underground tunnels, human shields. Hamas, unlike any other war, they have deep tunnels and hiding places that are very difficult to attack, and that's intentional. According to many scholars, this is intentional so that they don't care about the Palestinians themselves, and this makes Israel or anyone look very bad. And so they know that most nations today subscribe to the laws of warfare that prohibit indiscriminate targeting of civilians, of hospitals and schools and homes and neighborhoods, apartment buildings. Now, this is where we go back to Thomas Aquinas's double effect reasoning. Who intends to target and kill civilians? Is it really intentional, or is it foreseen but not intended? That's very, very difficult to determine. And again, it's supposed to be proportionate and all feasible steps taken to minimize casualties. So Israel says that they give warnings in advance. They tell people to move before they do something, and they're trying to minimize the casualties. If that's truly the case, then one could say that it's not intentional. There are others who say, no, it is intentional, that those things are just a smokescreen, they're not doing enough, and that it's actually intentional. Perhaps even they've been accused of it's genocidal. So you have a debate on that, but it's all using these criteria, all these principles to think through these questions one way or the other. Even if it's not intended and only foreseen, if it's disproportionate, there still may be culpability if it is recklessness. If Israel really is not doing enough, or any side in any war is not doing enough to minimize casualties, then it's hard to say that it's not intended, that it's only foreseen. So there's levels of culpability in there. What about blockade, siege, blocking food supplies, destroying infrastructure? This goes back in ancient times too, about sieges, and in the tradition, when you were doing a siege, you could only block 3 sides and allow 1 side as an avenue for civilians to escape or food and water to come in. Well, obviously that's not been the case for most of this conflict in Gaza. How do we define success? Israel's just cause, defense against Hamas, they say that their intent is to destroy, obliterate Hamas. Is that really possible? The United States declared a war against terror. Can we really eradicate it altogether? How do we define success in this situation with these circumstances? And then how do we establish a just and lasting peace? Who's going to be responsible? Who's going to participate? How do we establish a just and lasting peace for all involved? Not only one side, but for all sides involved. So Pope Francis, just a year ago, a little over a year ago, he said, "It is right and legitimate to defend oneself, yes, but let's please talk about self-defense so as to avoid justifying wars, which are always wrong." This is setting the stage for what I'm suggesting, that Pope Francis is worried about calling something a just war leads to seeing war as a normal thing. He's okay with talking about self-defense or legitimate defense with all the criteria involved. He thinks that might be the better way to go forward from a Catholic moral perspective. So many things have been used in recent decades with regard to this question about war and peace. I am proposing on the bottom right-hand side, integral defense, which kind of draws on all these approaches in order to try to establish a just peace. There are principles, there are practices, there are many things involved in these that if we synthesize them, maybe we can come up with an approach that does not just do away with just war, but incorporates it into the wider effort towards promoting and defending a just peace. So go in peace, glorifying the Lord by your life. Thank you to all involved. I will stop there and let's do some Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Winright, very much for your fascinating presentation. Really so interesting on multiple levels. We have several questions have come in. I thought we could start off with one of the questions touches on the idea of cherry picking in doctrine, and it kind of asks, maybe in a suspicious sense, is this happening with, for instance, with the church's just war doctrine? And I'll add maybe like a little bit of a specification to the question too. Is there a genuine development of doctrine from the early church to Augustine, from nonviolence to just war? That would be maybe one question. One way you can ask this question about development of doctrine on the when you can use force, right? So is there a genuine development there from the early church to Augustine? And then on another question could be, is there a genuine development from the early 20th century and Second Vatican Council all the way to Francis? Or is Francis departing somehow? I think sometimes people have heard of Francis's critiques of war and perhaps seem to think that he's departing, or he's breaking away, or going away from the church's just war tradition. So those are kind of two development of doctrine questions that I kind of noticed in the cherry picking comment. So I just thought I would just bounce those off of you. What do you think?
Well, that's a big question, that's for sure. I mean, there's been developments on many things with regard to from slavery to marriage, and many developments through the centuries. We've come up with many examples. So that's something that we need to be vigilant about to avoid just rationalizing and cherry picking. So going back to Hippolytus, I mean, this nonviolence theme, it's becoming more and more pronounced again, and I think almost every Catholic just war ethicist today really adheres to this stricter approach to permitting armed force. It's so strict that some like George Weigel and some others accuse us of being functionally pacifist. So that it's very difficult to even say here is a justified war that meets the criteria. And I'll even admit no war satisfies all the criteria perfectly. So there's some levels of degree there. Two of my teachers were actually well-known 20th century pacifists, Christian pacifist theologians, Stanley Hauerwas and John Howard Yoder. And I know they both take just war very seriously. And in fact, they have both written that if only Christians who purport to be just war Christians would take it seriously, they would appreciate that, and that would probably reduce the number of wars and violence in the world. So don't just abuse just war and cherry pick and rationalize whatever. This is a serious just war approach. that I'm trying to share here. I think that there have been times that it was not taken seriously. So the Crusades are a major example, where there was seen just cause, but then anything goes. Pull out all the stops, wipe out everybody, and there's this demonization of the other. And so there have been times where admittedly, just war has been abused. But the abuse, an old moral theology principle, is that the abuse does not negate the proper use. And even my teacher, John Howard Yoder, I mean, he even would ask, has there ever been a perfect marriage? There's nothing that's been perfect. There's John Courtney Murray talked about, the commandments, the 10 commandments are broken. Do we just jettison them because they're broken? So these principles, these criteria are according to Catechism and Vatican II, we expect there to be ethics even within the conduct of armed conflict. Pacifists would it be in agreement with kind of Machiavellian realists if they are arguing that, no, there is no ethics even during armed conflict. This is one space where, yeah, like Sherman said, war is hell and anything goes. That's not our position.
Thank you very much. Some of the themes in the discussion, I think, are informed or at least influenced by just war understandings that maybe are left over from the Second World War. Sometimes moral examples or analogies are drawn from the Second World War. For instance, defeating the Nazis. And obviously, when we go into the context of a Jewish-Christian dialogue, this becomes all the more serious because of our responsibility as Catholics to take that history so seriously, and all people of goodwill to understand the gravity with which the destruction the Holocaust caused. Is there a way to perhaps apply the criteria in that situation? As some people, raise up different examples from the Second World War and usually assume, that American responses to the access, to the powers was a just response. From the Catholic moral perspective or from the Catholic just war tradition, can you say something about the Second World War?
So, that's often called the good war by many people, but it was actually during, as World War II went on, some Catholic ethicists started reapplying just war to it. So for a while during the early 20th century, just war was kind of forgotten. John Courtney Murray in the 1950s wrote we actually are at fault. We did not teach the just war tradition well enough to Catholics. During World War II, John C. Ford, he was an American Catholic who wrote a famous article on theological studies addressing obliteration bombing, carpet bombing, and he used the criteria, in bello criteria. I mean, Catholic theologians thought we had jus ad bellum, we satisfied that during World War II, but the in bello, over time, the conduct of it, even by the Allies, started violating the principles of discrimination and proportionality. Now, at the time, the weaponry, I mean, they didn't have smart bombs and precision guided missiles and things like that yet, but still, John C. Ford, he argued that he actually quotes a lot of U.S. and British leaders at the beginning of World War II saying, we're not going to do like the Nazis and like the Japanese are doing and attack indiscriminately. We're actually going to hold the higher moral ground. Well, after a little while, can't beat them, join them. And so we started doing similar things. And they actually used words like we were going to terrorize the citizens in order to force their governments to surrender. And linked with that, the policy of unconditional surrender is something that just war theory is critical of. That, no, we should always allow for opportunities to negotiate a surrender.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Gene Korn here. Gene, I guess I can, your hand is up, but you did not submit a question, so I'm going to hit the allow to talk button.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Dr. Winright. I mean, your explication was very, very clear, and we appreciate that. It seems to me that the real stickiness of just war theory is when you begin to apply the theory to particular cases. And I'd like to talk about the particular case that you raised about the war between Israel and Hamas, in which you said that what Hamas didn't conform to the just war principles, and because there were many victims, Palestinian victims, what Israel's devastating response also seemed to have fallen short of Catholic just war theory. So I have one question, which kind of leads logically to a second question. The first question is, when one side in the war specifically uses human shields and has a strategy for their own civilians to be killed, who bears the responsibility for those civilians who are killed? Is it the fighting force that opposes the terrorism, that opposes Hamas, or is it Hamas who intentionally uses its own civilian population as the defense in human shields? And that leads to the second question, which is a question about proportionality. Of course, there have been many, many civilian deaths in Gaza. But what would be a proportional response by Israel or by any other force fighting in this situation? What would be a proportional response, considering that the objective or the goal of Hamas is existential, that is to destroy the entire Jewish state? Moreover, what would be statistically a proportional response, given that the civilian to combatant ratio of who's been killed in the Gaza war is about 1.5, 1.6, maybe even 1.7 to 1, which is less than it was in the World War II and the Korean War. In terms of the urban fighting, the United Nations has said the average ratio of civilian to combatant deaths in urban fighting is 9 to 1. And that, in fact, was the ratio when the United States and the international forces went after ISIS in Mosul. It was 9 to 1. And in Gaza, it's about 1.5 to 1. So if that's a disproportional response, what would be a proportional response?
Thank you for those. Thank you. Those are very important questions. So on the first one, most of the literature on this topic distinguishes between responsibility and culpability. So there can be a distinction there. Hamas, I would say, is culpable for the deaths in the sense that they are using Palestinians as human shields. Israel, the defense forces, have a responsibility. Now, this is one thing from a Catholic perspective, and many others share this, but those using armed force have a responsibility to be willing, and in recent decades, well, this goes back to Clinton, many militaries don't do this, but it used to be the expectation that they would be willing to put themselves more at risk than to put at more risk civilians, even of the opposing side. That is not really the way that most people go about it anymore. So I would say that, you know, the Israeli Defense Forces, they do have a responsibility to minimize these casualties. It is difficult. I mean, we don't have the tunnel rats like the American militaries in Vietnam. These are much more complicated tunnels that are so deep. And to actually, instead of dropping 2,000-pound bombs on, which doesn't seem to be having much effect, according to these videos on Hamas, there's still a lot of Hamas fighters around, to go in and more surgically, that's going to put Israeli soldiers at risk. And some just war ethicists I've been reading, they are saying like this actually, well, that's how it is, and they should be willing to do that. And it might actually be more effective, even though it's putting your own at more risk. As far as your second related question about proportionality, I mean, again, it's probabilities and proportionality, and there's not like at this number, but go one over or two over, or I mean, your ratios are very, very helpful. And actually, you are correct. I've read the same materials or similar ones that point out in Fallujah and other cases where actually we have not had as much of a public outcry about the civilian casualties and deaths and injuries, that it's been even more disproportionate in other instances. Why this one getting so much attention, but not these others? Well, I would say, we got to be careful about whataboutism. I want to be consistent across all of the board on all these cases. If something is more than necessary, then I will say it's disproportionate. It's hard to put a number on that, but it's sort of like what the Supreme Court used to say about pornography. We recognize it when we see it.
Thank you, Dr. Winright. We have a question next from Rabbi David Mayan, and then John Polakowski, and then Nermeen Rubin. Those are the three in the queue. So thank you, each person with a question. We're so glad that you're asking questions. So let's go ahead and go to the next question.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Winright. It was, as Eugene just said, it was a very clear and you managed to put a lot of stuff into your time that you had. So I appreciated that. Might be a very sort of basic question, but I was interested in towards the beginning of your talk, when you quoted from Pope Francis's 2017 Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace. And, in there you had the quote, you had to be true followers of Jesus today also includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence. And further there, he then quotes Benedict XVI saying, for Christians, nonviolence is not merely tactical behavior, but a person's way of being, the attitude of one who is so convinced of God's love and power that he or she is not afraid to tackle evil with the weapons of love and truth alone. Love of one's enemy constitutes the nucleus of the Christian revolution, and that the gospel command to love your enemies is rightly considered the Magna Carta of Christian nonviolence. So as you sort of continued in your talk, if you took that in isolation, it could easily sound like an absolute position of absolute pacifism. And then, but certainly, later on in section 6 that you had quoted from, it's a complement to other things we're doing. And even more so, like the quote you brought just recently of that Francis said, it is right and legitimate to defend oneself, or even the language of an inalienable right. So I just find that very confusing. It's sort of, is the claim here, because is the claim here that to be a true follower of Jesus is to do something that goes, well, especially the language of it's right and legitimate. Right really sounds like it's something you should do, not just that you're allowed to do. So I just don't understand how you can say this is what people should do, and it's not being a true follower of Jesus if you do it. I just find it very confusing, the combination of language there.
Yeah, and Pope Francis is not the first. I mean, Paul the Sixth and John the 23rd before, and John Paul II and Benedict. I mean, they talk about no more war, and war is a bad thing, but they did still allow for legitimate defense, the armed. And so, yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where in the Catholic tradition, for moral theology, for ethics, we draw on multiple sources, on scripture, which actually has conflicting messages on this, and also our tradition, and so yes, it really is. And so what I and others are trying to do is trying to like move us forward. Is there a way we can maybe synthesize these, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and it might not be without remainder, but that's kind of what we're working toward right now, and it's not easy, and it has led to a lot of confusion. I mean, I've lectured in Poland a couple of times, and including to veterans who were injured in Ukraine, and you know, they really, you know, as Catholics, they want to defend their people, and they're torn about this, but sometimes statements from the Vatican have made them feel unease, you know, and so I think we need to be, you know, pastoral as well as moral on these, and so we'll see where it goes.
Thank you, Dr. Winright, and thank you, David, for your question. Our next question is from Father John Polakowski, and then we will have a question from Nermeen Rubin. John, I don't see a question in the queue, so I'll just allow you to speak your question just briefly. And you'll have to unmute also.
Okay.
There we go. We can hear you now. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, Tobias. Just a couple comments on which may be questions regarding some of your points. First of all, in terms of the attitude in the first centuries, at the time that the bishop's pastoral letter, the U.S. bishop's pastoral letter was being written, a group of Christian historians, Christian historians, mostly Catholic, examined this question as to what was the attitudes in the first centuries. And they came up with a very mixed reading for the simple reason that one factor that often is left out is the fact that emperor worship was part of involvement in Roman military. And there's a feeling that some of the people who spoke out against participating in the military did so more because of emperor worship than they did on strict war peace questions. I think there's also, is there evolution? Not very clear-cut evolution. And I point out to what happened to Father Brian Hare. Father Brian Hare was one of the two parts. We have to remember that the bishop's pastoral letter, U.S. bishop's pastoral, had two committees. There was a biblical committee, and its report was far more pacifistic. There was the ethics committee headed by Father Brian Hare, and he was summoned to Rome by Ratzinger, who was then head of doctrine, for a meeting with the European theologians who objected to what the U.S. bishops were planning to do on this question, and particularly objected to the issue raised by Brian Hare in an article that that pacifism was now a morally acceptable option, not only for individuals, but even for a state. And the conclusion from that meeting in Rome was that it is now morally acceptable for individuals, but it is not morally acceptable for the leaders of nation states. And that seems to be where it still officially remains, actually. There hasn't been all that much significant development. So I just make just some of those comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One scholar historian I recommend is at Boston College, David Hunter, who has written a lot on the early Christian views. You're right, it's mixed, it's not a settled debate, which I think is an important reminder to many people. As far as the emperor worship, that's correct too. Some documents refer to bloodshed, some refer to the idolatry. And then there's other concerns, like the early Christians, when you're a persecuted minority, you're not even considering military as an option for, you know, it's not even an option. As far as Father Brian Hare, I know him and interact with him, and your history is accurate. In 1993, the United States bishops issued a subsequent document on the 10th anniversary of the Challenge of Peace called The Harvest of Justice is Sown in Peace. And it is in that document where they did refer to the Philippines, refer to the fall of the Eastern European nations, the communism there, and they did refer to mass nonviolent movements there in print. So there has been a little bit of an update on that.
Thank you, Tobias. We have a question from a friend of the CCJS, Nermeen Rubin, who asks about the responsibility of the Holy See and the nuncios with regard to making decisions on just war. So if there is relative misconduct about a respective war or country violating just war principles, whose responsibility is it to address that issue? And then after this question, we have one from Beryl Biles.
All right. Well, thanks. That's a wonderful question. At this time of St. Ambrose, going way back then, Emperor Theodosius, his troops did a massacre in Thessalonica, and Bishop Ambrose excommunicated him. Said, that was indiscriminate, that was unjust, and you're not welcome at communion until you confess. And back then they had public confession, and the emperor Theodosius did come. And so back then, in that, assuming that your emperor was Catholic, and the times have changed, but there's one example early on. Now, in Vatican I, 150 years ago, on the agenda there was war and peace, not just infallibility, papal infallibility, but on the agenda was war and peace. There was a Scottish Protestant, David Urquhart, who was friends with the Pope, and many bishops, most of the bishops supported his proposal. He saw many unjust wars in the late 19th century, and he wanted the Catholic Church to be the new entity that would adjudicate between just and unjust wars and hold nations accountable to that. Well, unfortunately, conflict broke out, and the First Vatican Council never got to address the question, although there's support for it, majority support for it at the time. So then, in the 20th century, we've had the League of Nations, United Nations. What's happened in the 20th century, the Vatican has tried to have a position of neutrality so that it can actually be the facilitator of negotiations. And so this has been a difficult time, especially since Ukraine, when Russia invaded Ukraine. The Pope Francis has been, careful not to come across as you're right, you're wrong. He says, oh, everyone is obvious, you should know, but he's trying to be a force for possible negotiation and peace settlement. So the Vatican has kind of assumed a different role, trying to arbitrate between different sides rather than taking a side.
Thank you, Tobias, for mentioning the doctrine of papal neutrality. Certainly is something in the background here worthy of more discussion at some point, perhaps a future session. We have one last question from Beryl Biles. She asks about the kind of thoughtful consideration of potential war behavior that you're discussing, a suggestion especially wise or a mature mentality. And she asks about, is this realistic? It seems that it might be unrealistic given a defensive posture. Any thoughts about that?
Well, soft power would fit under the just peacemaking practices that have been developed in the last few decades, trying to make sure that armed force is truly a last resort. So soft power is very, very important. That would be, I would see, under the umbrella of active nonviolence approaches. And definitely more needs to be done there. As far as the wise, mature behavior, back when 2003, when the United States was about to attack Iraq, United States bishops, as well as the Vatican, as well as almost every Catholic moral theologian, was really questioning the justice of going to that. I mean, we're really not convinced that it would be just. Well, one of my friends, William Kavanaugh, he wrote an article in Commonweal at the time, talking about, the role of prudential judgment, the virtue of prudence that we're all supposed to have, but especially it's a political virtue in Aquinas, and how actually the virtue of prudence was demonstrated more by others who are not in government. So, really, we do need maturity, integrity, and the virtue of prudence with regard to all these questions. And we need to do more to try to vote for people that demonstrate that. I will say that I have friends as well as former students in the United States military who even teach at West Point ethics. And it seems to me that there are many persons who actually have realistic experience, much more than I ever had, that display this virtue much more so than many people who are unfortunately elected to office in recent decades.
Thank you, Dr. Winright, for your comments this afternoon, and especially for handling our questions and challenging us with such interesting discussion of the church's teaching and its potential applications at different times in history. It's a challenging topic that spans years and years, and I think that this presentation, along with Dr. Firestone's, hopefully will go a long way to really building a sense in our communities of a greater understanding of one another, a deeper mutual understanding. Hopefully we've reached that. I want to thank all the attendees for tuning in today. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you have a very good day. Bye-bye.